The sun was setting over the city skyline, painting the sky with shades of gold and deep orange. On the rooftop of a tall luxury hotel, the atmosphere was filled with excitement. Guests in expensive suits and glamorous dresses were still lingering after the charity event, chatting, laughing, and watching as a famous billionaire prepared to leave in his private helicopter. The chopper sat waiting on the helipad, its blades still for now, but the sight of it alone carried an air of power and wealth. Security guards stood in neat formation, blocking curious onlookers from getting too close. Cameras from reporters flashed, catching every move of the man everyone called Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison was known everywhere for his wealth. His businesses stretched across different parts of the world: hotels, airlines, even technology companies. People admired him for his success, but at the same time, many felt he was unapproachable, a man living on a level far above ordinary lives. Tonight, though, his presence had thrilled the crowd. He had donated millions to the charity event and had made a speech about helping underprivileged children. His voice had been warm and steady, his smile convincing, and many people believed he truly cared. Now, as he walked toward his helicopter, his bodyguards moved swiftly to create a path. Among the clapping and chatter, a small figure pushed forward. She was much shorter than the adults, and she had to weave between them, her heart racing. She was a girl of around 12 years old, with bright, anxious eyes. Her name was Aisha. She wasn't dressed in glittering clothes like the other guests. Instead, she wore a simple faded dress and shoes that had clearly been worn many times before. She didn't belong to this world of shining jewels and expensive suits. But her eyes were filled with determination. She had to get close enough. She had to make him hear her. As Mr. Harrison reached the steps leading up to the helicopter, Aisha's voice broke through the crowd like thunder. "Don't get in the helicopter," she shouted. Her voice carried such force that conversation stopped, laughter froze, and heads turned in disbelief. The noise of the crowd faded instantly, replaced by a sharp silence. People looked around to find the source of the voice. When they saw it was just a young black girl, their expressions shifted from shock to confusion. Some whispered to each other, frowning. "Who is she? What is she doing here?" A few even laughed nervously, thinking it must be some kind of prank. Security guards immediately rushed forward, their stern faces showing anger. No one dared to shout at a billionaire, let alone a child who didn't even belong in the guest list. Aisha didn't run. She planted her feet firmly on the rooftop floor, her small fists trembling at her sides. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears, but she shouted again, louder this time, her eyes fixed on Mr. Harrison. "Please, don't get in the helicopter." Her voice cracked, filled with fear and urgency, and it echoed against the tall buildings surrounding the hotel. The security guards reached her in seconds. One of them held her arm, demanding to know why she was making a scene. "Step back, girl. You can't be here," another guard barked. The guests murmured louder, some pulling out their phones to record the incident. The billionaire paused mid-step, his polished shoes stopping just before the helicopter's shining metal stairs. His advisors, standing close by, whispered quickly into his ear. "Ignore her, sir. It's just a disturbance. Let's keep moving." But Mr. Harrison didn't move. His sharp eyes, trained from years of reading business deals and judging people's intentions, fell on the girl. For a moment, he didn't see her dress, her small frame, or her lack of status. He saw only the fear in her eyes, the way her voice carried a truth too heavy for a child to invent. "What did you say?" Mr. Harrison's deep voice cut through the rooftop air. A hush fell over the crowd again. Aisha took a breath, her chest rising quickly. She was scared, but she had come this far. She could not stop now. "Don't get in the helicopter," she repeated. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. The billionaire's advisors grew impatient. "Sir, please, let's move," one of them insisted, his hand reaching toward Harrison's arm. The pilot of the helicopter, already waiting inside, gave a signal that everything was ready. But Mr. Harrison lifted his hand slightly, signaling for everyone to wait. He narrowed his eyes at the girl, as if weighing her words carefully. The crowd gasped softly. Why was this powerful man listening to a child? The security guard, still holding Aisha's arm, demanded, "Tell us why. Why are you saying this?" He shook his head in frustration, convinced it was nonsense. But Aisha's small voice answered with surprising strength, "It's not safe. Please, don't." Her mother, who had been working quietly inside the hotel as part of the cleaning staff, came rushing onto the rooftop at that moment, her face pale with panic. She had heard the shouts and immediately knew it was her daughter. "Aisha," she cried, hurrying to pull her child back. Tears of fear sparkled in her eyes as she begged the guards not to harm her daughter. But Aisha stood her ground. She pulled gently away from her mother's grip and looked up at the billionaire with eyes that carried more weight than her age. "Something's wrong with the helicopter," she whispered, though her voice was still loud enough for those near to hear. "Please believe me." The rooftop filled with whispers and tension. Some laughed nervously again, saying children make up stories. Others frowned, sensing the seriousness of her tone. The flashing lights of cameras grew brighter as reporters captured every second of the unusual standoff. Mr. Harrison stayed silent for a few moments, and those moments felt like forever. His face was unreadable, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the helicopter, its polished body glowing under the evening sky. He looked back at the girl, her small figure trembling yet unbroken. Something about her words stirred his instincts. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady. "Stop," he said to his team. "No one gets on the helicopter. Not yet." The advisors exchanged panicked looks. The pilot shook his head, annoyed. The guards hesitated, unsure. But the billionaire's tone allowed no argument. He stepped away from the stairs and walked toward the girl. Every eye followed him as the crowd parted in silence. His expensive suit shimmered under the rooftop lights as he stopped just a few feet away from Aisha. "Why do you say this?" he asked gently, his voice softer now, yet still commanding. Aisha swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she lifted her chin bravely. "I heard people talking. They said something about the helicopter not being fixed right. They said it wasn't safe. I didn't understand everything, but I know it's dangerous." Her words came out quickly, rushed but filled with sincerity. The billionaire studied her, his face still unreadable. The guests watched with wide eyes, waiting to see what he would do next. The girl's mother clutched her hands together, whispering silent prayers. The air was thick with tension, the noise of the city far below fading into nothing. For one long moment, it felt like the whole world was waiting on Mr. Harrison's decision. And that was how the night began, with a billionaire on the edge of stepping into danger, and a young girl's desperate cry changing the course of everything. The rooftop was still buzzing with shock, but before anyone could fully understand why Aisha had shouted, her story had already started long before that night. To see why she risked everything to call out, we have to go back to the morning of the event. Aisha had woken up early in her small apartment across the city. Her mother, who worked as part of the hotel's cleaning staff, had shaken her gently and whispered, "Get ready, we need to go." For Aisha, weekends usually meant staying at home with her little brother, but on special days like this, she often went with her mother to the hotel. It was safer than leaving her alone in the neighborhood, and sometimes she helped by carrying small things or waiting quietly while her mother worked. That morning, Aisha had been full of curiosity. She knew a billionaire was coming to the hotel for a charity event. She had overheard her mother and other workers talking about it for weeks. People said he was one of the richest men in the country, that he owned planes, ships, and even hospitals. To Aisha, this sounded like the kind of story she usually only read in magazines left behind by guests. She never imagined she would actually see him up close. The hotel was glowing with activity. Workers polished the floors, arranged flowers, and checked every corner twice. Aisha trailed behind her mother as she carried cleaning supplies from one floor to another. Every so often, she stopped to peek around corners, amazed by the grand decorations. But it wasn't the chandeliers or the expensive furniture that caught her attention that day, it was the voices she heard when she slipped into the service corridor near the rooftop. She had been sent by her mother to fetch a mop from the storage room, and as she walked past a half-open door, she paused. Inside, two men in mechanic uniforms were speaking in low, worried tones. They didn't notice her because she was so small and quiet. Aisha froze, her ear tilted slightly toward the door, and the words drifted into her mind like sharp pieces of glass. "I told you it's not safe," one of the men hissed. "The fuel line isn't secure. That part hasn't been replaced yet." "Keep your voice down," the other snapped. "We don't have time for a new part now. They said the helicopter must be ready tonight. If we delay, we lose the contract." Aisha's heart began to beat faster. She didn't understand everything, but she knew enough to realize they were talking about the helicopter. The same helicopter that belonged to the billionaire. She leaned closer. "If something happens in the air, it won't be our fault," the first man said nervously. "It's on them for ignoring the risk." The second man muttered something she couldn't hear clearly, but she caught the words dangerous and pray nothing goes wrong. Aisha's eyes widened. She didn't know about engines or machines, but the fear in their voices was real. She bit her lip, holding her breath, and then carefully stepped back before they noticed her. Her hands trembled as she carried the mop back to her mother. The whole time, her mind repeated the words, "not safe, dangerous, fuel line." At first, she tried to brush it away. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't so serious. But as the hours passed, her worry grew. She thought about the billionaire, the important guest everyone was preparing for. What if something happened when he flew away? What if the helicopter fell from the sky? The thought made her chest tighten. She tried to tell her mother quietly when they were cleaning a room. "Mama, I heard two men talking about the helicopter. They said something was wrong." Her mother frowned, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Aisha, don't make stories. These are grown-up matters. Stay out of it." "But I'm not making it up," Aisha insisted, tugging at her sleeve. "They said it was dangerous." Her mother sighed. "Even if it's true, what can we do? People like us have no voice here. They will not listen to a child. Promise me you will stay quiet, Aisha." But Aisha couldn't promise. She nodded to calm her mother, but inside she felt restless. Her stomach twisted with the weight of the secret. She couldn't enjoy the food they gave the staff later, nor the music drifting from the ballroom. All she could think about was the billionaire stepping into that helicopter, unaware of the danger. As the evening drew closer, the charity event began. Aisha watched from a distance as the guests arrived in shining cars. Men in tuxedos, women in gowns. It felt like watching a movie. She saw her mother and the other staff working harder than ever, moving trays of food, arranging drinks, and cleaning up after careless guests. She sat in a quiet corner, her small legs swinging nervously, her mind still heavy with what she had heard. Then, she saw him. Mr. Harrison. He was taller than she expected, his presence commanding even without words. His suit was simple but elegant, and the people around him treated him with great respect. Aisha stared, thinking, this is the man. The one in danger. Throughout the evening, she kept glancing at him. He gave a speech, his voice calm and strong, about helping children, about giving opportunities to the poor. The audience clapped, impressed. But Aisha kept thinking, what if he never makes it home tonight? When the event ended, she followed her mother to the rooftop, where the helicopter waited. The sound of cameras flashing filled the air as people gathered to see him leave. Aisha's heart began to pound so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. The helicopter sat on the shining helipad, its body sleek and proud under the rooftop lights. The blades were still, but the pilot was already inside, ready to start. She looked around. No one else knew what she knew. No one else seemed worried. She bit her lip, her small fists tightening. She remembered the voices in the corridor, the fear in the mechanic's words, and her mother's warning to stay quiet. But then she thought about what would happen if she said nothing and the helicopter crashed. Her chest rose and fell quickly as the billionaire walked forward, his guards surrounding him. Every step he took closer to the helicopter felt like thunder in her ears. She could no longer stay silent. She broke free from her mother's side and pushed through the crowd. Adults frowned as she squeezed between them, some muttering angrily about her rudeness. But she didn't care. She could see the billionaire now, just a few steps away from climbing into danger. Her throat tightened, but she forced her voice out, louder than she thought possible, "Don't get in the helicopter." The rooftop froze. The words hung in the air, sharp and urgent. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. And that was how a simple girl from the service corridors ended up standing between life and death, her secret about to shake the world around her. The rooftop was so silent that even the hum of the city below seemed to vanish. Every eye was fixed on the strange sight before them, a billionaire standing frozen mid-step and a little girl crying out with all her courage. Cameras from reporters flashed brightly, recording the moment that no one could have expected. The security guards were stiff with confusion, unsure if they should push the girl away or wait for orders. Aisha's mother held her breath, clutching her chest as if her heart might break from fear. Mr. Harrison, the billionaire everyone admired, turned slowly toward the girl. His eyes, sharp from years of reading boardroom contracts and sensing lies in business deals, locked on her trembling figure. She was small, fragile-looking, with a simple dress that looked out of place among the glittering gowns and polished tuxedos. But her eyes burned with something undeniable honesty. "Repeat what you said." Harrison's voice was low but carried across the rooftop. The advisors at his side stepped in quickly, their voices rushing to cover the child's words. "Sir, ignore this nonsense. She's a child. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Please, let's get you on board." One of them even tugged gently at his arm, eager to keep him moving forward before the crowd began to think something was wrong. But Harrison raised his hand. The advisors froze. He had not built an empire by ignoring his instincts, and his instincts now whispered to pause. He looked back at the girl, his face unreadable, and asked again, louder this time, "Why did you say not to get in?" Aisha's throat was dry, but she took a shaky step forward, ignoring the guard's tight grip on her arm. "It's not safe," she said, her voice trembling but strong enough to be heard. "Please, don't go in the helicopter." A ripple went through the crowd. Some people gasped softly. Others laughed nervously, shaking their heads. To them, it was unthinkable that a billionaire's life could be interrupted by the warning of a child. But Harrison didn't laugh. He narrowed his eyes, studying her face, her tone, her body language. He saw no trace of mischief or attention-seeking. Instead, he saw pure desperation. "Sir," the pilot called out from the cockpit, raising his voice over the quiet tension, "the helicopter is ready. We're clear for departure. Everything is fine." His voice was steady, but there was a faint edge of irritation, as if he found the whole interruption embarrassing. Aisha's small chest rose and fell quickly as she shook her head. "No. It's not fine. I heard them talking. They said it wasn't fixed right. They said it was dangerous." Her words spilled out in a rush, almost like a confession. The crowd murmured louder now, their confusion deepening. Reporters leaned forward eagerly, capturing every sound. The advisors exchanged looks of annoyance. One leaned close to Harrison and whispered, "She's probably imagining things. Let's not delay. The longer we stand here, the worse it looks." But Harrison didn't move. He bent slightly, lowering his tall frame to better see Aisha's face. The lights from the rooftop gleamed against his glasses as he asked, "Who did you hear?" Aisha's voice cracked. "Two men in the service corridor. They said the fuel line wasn't fixed. They said it could be dangerous." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some dismissed her words instantly. What did a child know about helicopters? But others caught the trembling urgency in her voice and felt a chill crawl over their skin. The security guard holding her arm muttered, "She's just a kid, sir. Should I remove her?" His hand tightened as if to pull her away. But Harrison surprised everyone. "No," he said firmly. He straightened, his powerful voice echoing against the night air. "No one touches her." He looked at his head of security. "Call the engineers. Have the helicopter checked again. Now." The rooftop exploded with whispers. The advisors protested at once. "Sir, this is unnecessary. We've had this machine inspected twice today. It's a waste of time, and you'll look foolish in front of everyone." "Better to look foolish than to be dead," Harrison replied sharply, his tone silencing them instantly. His words cut like steel, leaving no room for argument. The pilot stepped out, clearly frustrated. "With all due respect, sir, I've flown this aircraft for years. It's safe. If we start doubting every rumor, we'll never leave." But Harrison's gaze was steady. "Then you won't mind one more check," he said simply. His decision was final. The pilot clenched his jaw but said nothing more. As the engineers were summoned, Aisha's mother tried to pull her back again, whispering, "Why did you do this, child? They will blame us." Tears filled her eyes, certain that her daughter's boldness would bring trouble. But Aisha whispered back, "I couldn't let him die, Mama." Her voice was small but filled with conviction. Minutes later, two engineers hurried up the rooftop with their toolboxes. The advisors rolled their eyes and muttered to each other about delays, but Harrison stood still, arms crossed, watching carefully. The crowd, now fully captivated, leaned forward as the engineers opened panels and examined the helicopter under the bright rooftop lights. Every tick of the clock felt longer than the last. The whir of tools echoed in the silence. Guests murmured nervously, unsure what the outcome would be. Aisha bit her lip so hard it hurt, her small hands gripping her mother's arm tightly. Finally, one of the engineers let out a sharp gasp. His face turned pale as he looked up at Harrison. "Sir," he said carefully, "there is indeed a fault in the fuel line. It's not secure. If you had taken off tonight, there was a high risk of failure mid-air." The rooftop erupted. Gasps, cries, and shocked voices filled the night. Some people clapped a hand over their mouths. Others turned to stare at the small girl who had spoken up. Reporters' cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the billionaire's reaction. Harrison's advisors went speechless. The pilot's face turned red, his confidence shaken. Security exchanged nervous glances. Harrison's eyes moved slowly from the engineers back to Aisha. The cold steel in his gaze melted into something softer, something almost like gratitude. He stepped forward, past his stunned staff, and stopped in front of the girl. The crowd parted, holding its breath. For a moment, Harrison simply looked at her. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he bent down so his eyes were level with hers. "You saved my life," he said quietly. His deep voice carried enough weight for all to hear. Aisha's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded bravely. She didn't need thanks. She only needed to know she had been heard. Behind them, the rooftop still buzzed with shock. Some guests whispered about how close tragedy had been. Others admired the girl's courage. Reporters scribbled furiously, already writing headlines in their minds, "Billionaire saved by brave girl's warning." But at that moment, none of it mattered to Aisha. All she felt was relief. Relief that she had shouted when it counted most. Relief that her voice, small as it was, had been enough to stop something terrible from happening. The night air was heavy with emotions, fear, awe, and gratitude, yet above it all stood one undeniable truth: a billionaire had chosen to listen to a little girl, and that choice had changed everything. The engineers worked quickly, their hands moving with practiced speed, checking every part of the helicopter that could be unsafe. The crowd on the rooftop watched every movement, whispers growing louder with every tick of the clock. Reporters' cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every tense moment, every twitch of the billionaire's face, and the little girl standing bravely in the middle of the chaos. Aisha's small hands trembled slightly as she held onto her mother. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her chest. She hadn't expected to be in this position, but she knew she couldn't back down now. Her voice had been heard, but would anyone take it seriously? She swallowed hard as she watched the engineers' expressions change from routine focus to concern. Finally, one of the engineers straightened and took a deep breath. "Sir," he said, pointing toward Harrison, "there is a serious problem with the fuel line. If the helicopter had taken off in its current condition, there could have been a malfunction mid-flight. The risk was high." The words sent a shockwave through the crowd. Some guests gasped audibly, others whispered frantic questions to their neighbors. The advisors around Harrison looked stunned, their previous confidence replaced with worry. The pilot, who had insisted everything was fine, took a step back, his face pale. He could no longer argue, the evidence was clear. Harrison stood perfectly still for a moment, processing the news. His eyes shifted to the little girl who had shouted the warning. She was still trembling, but there was a quiet strength in her stance. The wind lifted strands of her hair, and the rooftop lights made her eyes glint like tiny, determined stars. He walked slowly toward her, his large shoes making quiet thuds against the rooftop. The crowd parted instinctively, leaving a clear path. Harrison reached down, bending slightly so that he could meet her gaze. The tension in the air seemed to pause as he spoke, his voice calm but full of gravity. "You saved my life," he said simply. His words were gentle but carried across the rooftop like a powerful wave. He looked at her with respect, the kind of respect that isn't earned by wealth or status but by courage and honesty. "If you hadn't spoken up, I would have been in serious danger." Aisha's mother gasped softly, her hands trembling as she held onto her daughter. "You did the right thing, sweetheart," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Aisha nodded, feeling relief wash over her like a warm wave. She had done it. She had stopped something terrible from happening. The crowd was silent for a moment, still processing the incredible scene they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, murmurs of admiration and shock spread. Guests who had been skeptical of the girl's warning began whispering among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Reporters hurriedly recorded everything, knowing they had a story that would spread worldwide. Harrison turned back to the helicopter, his expression hardening with thought. "This could have ended badly," he said, his voice low but firm. "We can't leave until everything is double-checked. No shortcuts. I want full assurance before I even think about stepping in that cabin again." The engineers nodded immediately, moving with renewed urgency. Harrison's advisors exchanged glances, some reluctantly impressed, others frustrated at the delay. They had been planning this rooftop departure as a symbol of success, a display of power and wealth, but now the narrative had completely changed. The little girl's bravery had stolen the spotlight. Meanwhile, The reporters began interviewing Aisha, who stood with a quiet dignity despite her small size. "How did you know it was dangerous?" one reporter asked, leaning in. Aisha's voice was steady, though her hands fidgeted with her dress. "I overheard the men talking. They said it wasn't fixed properly. I had to say something," she explained simply. The camera crew nodded, capturing her every word. There was something compelling about the way she spoke, not only her bravery but also her honesty. Harrison, watching from a short distance, felt a mix of gratitude and admiration. Here was a child who didn't care about money, fame, or recognition. She cared about life. After a few more tense minutes, the engineers gave a final nod to Harrison. "It's fixed now, sir," one of them said. "We've secured the fuel line properly, and all systems are safe for flight." The relief was tangible. Harrison finally exhaled, a deep breath that seemed to release all the tension he had held inside. He looked at Aisha again, a faint smile breaking across his usually serious face. "You were right," he said. "You were absolutely right to stop me." The rooftop erupted in applause, some guests cheering softly, others clapping loudly. The pilot, though initially annoyed at the delay, approached Harrison with respect, bowing slightly. "Sir, your decision to listen was wise. We're ready to depart now, safely." Harrison turned to Aisha once more, crouching slightly to speak to her at eye level. "Because of you, everyone here is safe. You showed courage when it mattered most. Remember that always." Aisha's eyes sparkled with tears, a mixture of pride and relief. She nodded, her small voice barely audible but filled with meaning. "I just wanted to help," she said. The billionaire nodded, understanding perfectly. Sometimes, helping wasn't about recognition or reward. It was about doing what was right, no matter the risk or the audience. As the helicopter prepared for takeoff again, Harrison waved to the crowd, but his eyes kept returning to Aisha. He had learned something invaluable tonight. Sometimes the smallest voices could make the biggest difference. The crowd, inspired by the little girl's courage, began talking excitedly among themselves. The story of the brave child who had saved a billionaire would spread far beyond that rooftop, touching hearts everywhere. Harrison stepped into the helicopter carefully, his movements deliberate. The engines roared to life, but there was no fear now. Everything had been checked, everything was secure. He waved one last time to Aisha, who waved back, her small hand raised high. The rooftop slowly emptied as the helicopter lifted into the night sky, leaving a stunned but inspired crowd behind. People whispered about the incredible courage of one little girl, and the billionaire who had listened. Some even admitted they had underestimated her, but now they knew better. For Aisha, the night was unforgettable. She had faced fear, spoken the truth, and seen the power of honesty and courage. Her mother held her close, pride and relief mixing in her heart. The city lights below seemed to sparkle a little brighter, as if celebrating the bravery of one small girl whose voice had changed everything. And Harrison, soaring above the city, couldn't help but reflect on what he had learned. Power, wealth, and success were important, but tonight, he realized, courage and honesty were far more valuable. One small act, one brave voice, had reminded him and everyone watching that true strength wasn't measured by money or status, but by the willingness to do what was right, even when it seemed impossible. The next morning, news of the rooftop incident had spread everywhere. Social media was flooded with videos and photos of the little girl who had shouted, "Don't get in the helicopter." Everyone was talking about her courage, from local newspapers to national television. People were inspired, amazed, and even a little stunned. How could a small child have such bravery and clarity to stand up to one of the world's wealthiest men? Aisha woke up feeling nervous but proud. Her mother, still holding her hand, guided her through breakfast while glancing at the TV where the story was being replayed for the 100th time. "Look, sweetheart," her mother said softly, People are noticing what you did. They're seeing how brave you were. Aisha nodded, a small smile on her lips. She didn't fully understand the attention, but she knew she had done the right thing. That was enough for her. Still, she felt a flutter of excitement. She had always believed that speaking up was important, but now she saw how her voice could really make a difference. Meanwhile, Harrison was in his private office, reflecting on the events of the previous night. The helicopter incident had shaken him more than he expected. He had always relied on his team, his wealth, and his experience to make the right decisions, but last night had reminded him that true guidance could come from anywhere, even a child. He called his advisors into the room, a serious expression on his face. "I want to meet this girl," he said firmly. "She has something more to teach me about courage, honesty, and responsibility than I've seen in years of experience." The advisors exchanged surprised looks but quickly nodded. Harrison rarely asked for such personal meetings, especially with someone so young. Later that day, Harrison's team arranged a private meeting with Aisha and her mother. When she entered the room, Aisha felt a mix of nervousness and curiosity. She had never met someone like Harrison before, a man whose presence filled the room, whose voice demanded attention, yet whose eyes showed genuine interest. Harrison greeted her warmly, kneeling slightly to meet her at eye level. "Aisha," he said softly, "I wanted to thank you again for your bravery. You reminded me that being cautious and listening to others is more important than pride or rush. I want to honor that." Aisha's eyes widened. She wasn't sure what he meant by honor, but the tone of his voice made her feel proud. "I just wanted to help," she said quietly. Harrison smiled, nodding slowly. "And you did. You helped more than just me. You helped everyone on that rooftop. And now, I want to help others the way you helped me. I want to start a program for children who show courage, honesty, and leadership, just like you did." Her mother gasped softly, tears forming in her eyes. "Aisha, you've changed everything," she whispered. Aisha looked down, shy but happy, feeling proud without needing anyone to tell her. Over the next few weeks, Harrison worked tirelessly to create the program he had promised. He visited schools, hosted workshops, and invited children to speak about the values of honesty, bravery, and responsibility. The news media followed closely, celebrating the initiative inspired by a small child who had spoken up when it mattered most. Aisha, though only 8 years old, became a symbol of courage. Teachers, parents, and children alike shared her story, discussing how speaking up could make a real difference. She was invited to speak at local schools, always nervous but always determined to share her message. Each time she told her story, she reminded her audience that it wasn't about fame or reward, it was about doing what was right. Harrison continued to stay in touch with Aisha and her family. He often invited her to the office, asking her opinion on projects, encouraging her to share her thoughts, and listening carefully to her ideas. He realized that her insights were often simple but profound, reminding him to think in ways he had long forgotten: honest, direct, and fearless. One day, Harrison arranged a large event to officially launch the foundation inspired by Aisha. Children from across the city were invited, along with educators, journalists, and community leaders. Aisha, wearing a bright dress, stood at the center of the stage as Harrison introduced her to the crowd. "This young girl," Harrison began, his voice strong and clear, "saved my life and reminded me that courage and honesty are far more powerful than wealth or status. She is the reason we are all here today, and she will inspire a generation to speak up and act with integrity." The audience erupted in applause. Aisha's small hands trembled as she waved to the crowd. She felt nervous but proud, seeing so many people smiling, nodding, and even crying at her courage. In that moment, she understood the true power of her voice and the difference it could make. Over time, the foundation grew. It provided mentorship programs for children, workshops on leadership, and support for young people who wanted to make a difference in their communities. Harrison became a mentor not just for Aisha but for the countless children whose lives were touched by her story. Aisha, as she grew older, never forgot that rooftop moment. She remembered the fear, the tension, and the responsibility she felt. She remembered how a single act of bravery had changed not only her life but the lives of many others. Her courage had sparked a movement, and she carried that lesson with her into every challenge she faced. For Harrison, the experience transformed him as well. He became more attentive, more compassionate, and more aware of the value of listening to others, no matter their age or status. He often reflected on how a single child's voice had changed his perspective, his priorities, and even the way he led his company. The story of Aisha and the billionaire helicopter incident became legendary. People wrote articles, made videos, and shared her story worldwide. It wasn't just a tale of fear and danger, it was a story of courage, honesty, and the incredible impact one person, even a small child, could have. Years later, Aisha would tell her own children about that night. She would describe the wind on the rooftop, the roaring of the helicopter, and the moment she had shouted with everything inside her, "Don't get in the helicopter." She would teach them that courage wasn't about being fearless, but about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. Harrison, now older and wiser, would look back on that moment as a turning point in his life. He had learned that true success wasn't measured by money, power, or recognition, but by the lives he could touch and the courage he could encourage in others. A small girl had reminded him of the human values that mattered most: honesty, bravery, and the willingness to act when it counted. The city remembered Aisha too. Schools named awards after her, celebrating children who showed courage in their everyday lives. Community leaders often spoke of her bravery, reminding everyone that even the smallest voice could change the world. And in the quiet moments, when she thought back to that night on the rooftop, Aisha would smile. She had faced fear, spoken the truth, and made a difference. She had saved a life, inspired a billionaire, and started a movement that would impact generations. All because she had listened to her heart and dared to speak up when it mattered most. In the end, it wasn't the helicopter, the billionaire, or even the crowd that mattered. It was the courage of a small girl who knew what was right. And that courage, once spoken, had created ripples that would never fade. The world had seen her bravery, but more importantly, the world had learned that sometimes the strongest voices come from the most unexpected places, and that one act of honesty and courage could change everything.